So welcome today. I am Dr. Sue Chen. I have the privilege of being the clinical director of the HL7 CodeX FHIR Accelerator. And we're here today for our open Q&A forum based off of any questions folks may have from the FHIR Shorthand or FISH seminar, where we've been getting started with new tools to create swimmingly slick implementation guides. And if you know this crew, you know that they like their aquatic puns. So we'll get started first with a quick welcome and panel introduction, a few session norms, and then we'll dive in quickly to questions before closing out. We wanted to just give a brief introduction to what we are and what we do and why we're hosting this. And so as CodeX, we are one of the FHIR accelerators promoting adoption and development of FHIR standards. And in our area, we specifically focus on clinical specialty FHIR standards, primarily in oncology, genomics, and cardiovascular disease. We began with oncology, and so our most mature FHIR specification is the M-code standard, which stands for Minimal Common Oncology Data Elements, and as such is hopefully representative of the most commonly used cancer data elements and can serve thus as a common lingua franca to represent the clinical meaning of cancer data, whether it's used from multiple perspectives and across different use cases, be it from vendor, payer, providers, patients, research, government regulatory perspectives, etc. But the thing is that these data standards, they're really only valuable if they're used widely, used effectively, and in real world settings. And in doing so, at CodeX, we really value our community so that they can help us with the real world input, expertise, and kind support needed to really have the frontline input needed to hone prioritization and development of pilots that demonstrate the maturity, develop the robustness needed to let these data standards fly in the real world. But those data standards can really only be used if they are created. And so that is where we have this FISH seminar. FHIR Shorthand or FISH is a really great tool for developing FHIR IGs. It's simple to use, even I can use it. And so that's a testament to how great it is. And in promoting this, we hope that this helps the development and maturation of FHIR, not only in the work that we do in CodeX, but all over the FHIR universe. So here we have a really fabulous panel here today. We have representation from not only the M-code specification development team, but also the FHIR Shorthand team. And so I'm really thrilled to introduce our panelists, Mark Kramer, Chris Moselle, May Terry, and Max Masnick. And then our moderator today will be Callie Phillips. But just before I turn it over to Callie, just note, if you're not speaking, if you could please mute your microphone to avoid background noise, we'd appreciate it. And that this call will be recorded and made publicly available after this event. We're going to try and address everyone's questions, but those we can't, we'll try to arrange follow-up either through Zulip or offline. To ask your questions, please raise your hand, post in our Zulip stream. I'll copy this link in the chat in just a second, or post in the chat to line up for discussion. And now I'll turn it over to you, Callie.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Sue said, if you have a question, feel free to use the Zoom function to raise your hand, and then I will call on you and you can come off mute and ask your question. Or you can also post your question to the Zulip stream here. So with that being said, let's get started. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. If not, we can start off with a first question we have is, what are some common pitfalls we see in IG development, both from a technical perspective and a community perspective?
Someone's got to be the first to speak. So, hi, everybody. My name is Mark Kramer. I'm one of the co-inventors of FHIR Shorthand with Chris Moselle. I'm really glad that you've had the opportunity to learn about FHIR Shorthand this week. It was a language that was born out of necessity, I think. There were very few good ways to create IGs Several years ago now, we sort of came up with the idea of a language like FHIR Shorthand, and actually worked on a language that was similar but different. It's sort of our first attempt. So you're looking at our second attempt at this language. I'm glad now that it's been applied to a lot of IGs. I will get around to answering that question. We're seeing it, applied to, I don't know, a couple of hundred projects worldwide. And some of those IGs get used and some of them are not going to get used. And I think the biggest pitfall is not gathering together people who are committed to the standards process and to use the results of an IG development process. And we've certainly made that mistake here at MITRE as well. If you approach this as an academic exercise, you're likely to have a nice piece of work at the end of the day and no adopters. So I would say to everyone that the success of any standards effort, including IGs, is going to be whether you can get a critical mass of users together even before the standard was created. So that I think is number one, and I'll pass it on to anyone else who'd like to cite any other success factors.
Yeah, I can jump in. Thank you, Mark. I think that sets the stage for quite a bit of discussion. For those who don't know me, I'm May Terry. I'm a health informaticist at MITRE, a clinician as well as an engineer/data analyst. And I am one of the contributors to the MCode FHIR implementation guide. I've also, which ended up being migrated over, from one particular platform to FISH, and it's been a really good success story behind that. And I've also done migrations between other forms of representing IGs, as in the clinical genomics reporting IG, which was originally all done using an HL7 spreadsheet method over to FISH. That was quite an undertaking, but it involved quite a bit of the community in the work group in order for that to happen. And that was also very successful too, admittedly, now that they've published the reporting IG into its second standard for trial use publication. Now to answer the question on the pitfalls, another perspective to add is not necessarily just the community, but really scoping what the business problem is or the clinical problem is that you're trying to solve. I've done, I think last year, or maybe a couple of years ago, a presentation at FHIR Dev Days called Clinical Requirements to FHIR, which really tried to provide a methodology of identifying the problem, the key information elements, regardless of whether it's FHIR or some other form, and then trying to synthesize that into a translation that ends up being expressed, in using a tool, using FISH syntax, and then ultimately creating a FHIR IG. And oftentimes, what I've seen happen initially is not just the community, but sometimes either overscoping of the issue or not exactly clearly stating the problem and jumping immediately into what FHIR resources there are. If there is an initial check of the problem that you're trying to solve, and really trying to take that community, oftentimes, which is a non-technical one, being able to distill it into clear information elements that are not model specific, and then convert them to FHIR, that ends up having a lot more of a successful way or adoption, because then you don't have to explain too much of the FHIRisms behind it. It is the model that is fit for purpose that usually ends up being the more successful one. So that is a common pitfall, and hopefully in some of the discussions here or in the talks, if there are questions, I'll be happy to entertain that perspective.
Great, thanks, May. For Mark, we have a follow-up question. What's the role in a FHIR Accelerator in getting stakeholders to participate in standards development? I think you might be on mute, Mark.
Yes, of course I'm on mute. It has to happen during one seminar, every seminar, so I've handled it for all of us now. Yeah, so probably a lot of us could answer that, and many of us have been involved with FHIR accelerators. You know, I think HL7 has changed a lot over the past few years. The center of gravity has shifted from the work groups to accelerators to some extent. To some extent, the you know, a lot of the action is with accelerators, which is a much more dynamic environment, I think, because it brings together. It really is focused on solving a problem for a set of stakeholders. You know, and that's a great place to start. For one thing, if you haven't picked a problem that's significant, you won't be able to gather the stakeholders, and the accelerator wouldn't get off the ground. So kind of the existence of the accelerator is testimony to interest in a problem area. And you know, the kinds of accelerators we've seen solve some very practical problems, like provider payer exchange, and Da Vinci is a good example. Like there's a lot of interest in making those connections work better than they do currently. So, you know, the accelerators are a good thing. I don't like the pay to play aspect of it, but that, you know, that may actually, when people pay to play, they do play. If they're just volunteering, maybe not so much. So you know, the older way to do it with work groups, it was like a single person or several people came together, 2 work groups, proposed to solve a problem, and did it at their own pace. You know, whether that was you know, 2 years or 5 years, it was just, you know, meeting to meeting, every 3 meetings a year. You know, you get this update, and oftentimes the update was, I didn't have time to work on it. And you're not seeing that through the accelerators. So I think it's a very positive step forward.
Great. So next, Root asked a question from the Zoom chat. How do IG authors find relevant existing IGs they should be considering to avoid reinventing the wheel or inadvertently causing an incompatibility?
Sorry, that was my mistake. I queued up the wrong question for you. I was actually going to ask that question next as a way to point at a resource that I think we talk about it in the course, but you may not have seen it. We have something called Fish Finder, which you can find at fishschool.org, and I'll stick it in the chat. But this can be useful both if you're just trying to see the different IGs that are out there, but also seeing how different IGs use fish and use other techniques in IG development. So Mark was mentioning that a bunch of IGs are using fish now. There's now 296 IGs on this list that are using fish in some capacity. Not all of them are using it the same way, but that does mean that they are at least doing something with fish in those IGs. So for anyone who's interested in this, it might be worth at least scrolling through at some point.
Great, and Max put that link in the Zoom chat as well. So this question was directed at May. Did you see GoFish for genomics IG, or was that pre-GoFish? If so, if it was pre-GoFish, how would you have changed the migration?
Question.
So GoFish was a little too early. in its release to effectively support the original migration that we did for the genomics reporting IG, which was, I think, not last year, but the year before. What we ended up doing was an interesting hybrid migration when it first started. Originally, they had a lot of the generation of the IG using this HL7 spreadsheet method. We ended up transcribing the equivalent of some of these structure definitions and pieces to FISH syntax. And then the examples we preserved as is in its JSON form, which we ended up putting in a directory. As GoFish started to mature, we were taking small pieces of it and trying it out and putting it back into FISH syntax. And I think that was actually a good way to go, because another thing to be mindful of, maybe back then and maybe still it happens today, is that there are certain IGs or communities of folks that create IGs that might use different toolings. So their preference might still be, for whatever reason, it might be some other form and not inherently FISH. So having the tooling like this as an extra option really helps to bring in multiple contributors to participate in different ways. And I don't know that I would change too much. If it was available earlier, we definitely it would have been helpful, especially for the example, since there are so many in the genomics reporting IG. Another thing I posted on the chat, which is also kind of good to know, is that GoFish is now a really nice tool for folks to now create FISH syntax. Again, CAP has done this recently, and that was a nice, pleasant surprise to hear that they originally crafted or handcrafted these JSON examples. And they just brought it into FISH syntax, and and working on a current project with them on exploring biomarkers representation. That's exactly what they did, and it happened very quickly to suddenly start creating examples. So it was a very effective tool for us, and I'm excited for it, frankly. Hopefully that answers.
And Mark asked a question in the chat, and he said, how are people going to use FISH? And also, if maybe this could be directed at Chris, and that could give us a little more background about GoFish.
I think, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's hoping actually the audience here will help us understand how FISH is being used in the wider community, and what are other efforts folks are interested in learning FISH. What are some potential projects where FISH is going to be employed for future FHIR IG authoring efforts?
Yeah, I don't think we should do all the talking. Do you?
Okay, well, then does anyone in the audience have an answer for that?
Do we have a prize for the first audience member?
I was going to say we forgot to do the virtual prizes, but I don't know. This is Kim with the CodeX PMO, and I was wondering, maybe Melissa, Christian, not to put you on the spot, but just kind of curious if you all have had any experience or thought much further down the path, considering the cardiovascular work that you're doing. Will you all be using FISH, and is there anything you would like to add, perhaps?
Nothing to add, but we discussed this morning at our small group team meeting for CodeX. So discussing it currently.
Great.
Maybe if I can add, maybe just to spark some additional, ideas or conversations, how you might want to use it. I've been using, FISH in some ways just to quickly get ideas down of how I think about representing things in FHIR. So here's an example with the HL7 Odyssey Fire to OMOP initiative that's going on. There are certain possibilities of how one could translate between FHIR and OMOP. And there's different, kinds of constructs you can, explore, like concept maps, and how would it look like if you created an example of what that translation could look like. And for me, it was, I can just, spin up, just an instance, put some examples down there and, published it to GitHub and created, even if it's unofficial, you have that nice little purple banner, so that way people know it's not official. And now it becomes a common conversation piece without it being official and going through any kind of balloting process. So I was almost treating it like almost like my own little Jupyter notebook, right? Except that we're expressing things in FISH and trying things out. And I think, when you kind of embrace it that way, it helps one think about, how to write a good IG in terms of what your front matter could be. Just simply creating, again, already within that FHIR IG environment, already just getting your thoughts on quote paper, except it ends up being this unofficial IG that's just a conversation piece. I did that as well for biomarkers. Again, nothing official, but I think once I ended up presenting it to folks who are outside of this whole deep FHIR community, it really provided a common ground, right? I think it made the ideation better, even as you're trying out new possibilities.
I'll add that I find little snippets of FHIR shorthand to be really useful in just trying to communicate constraints when talking about an IG, like on Zulip, and if you're working with a group of people who sort of speaks FISH, it's just a very concise, efficient way to talk about different ways of modeling data, which I really like.
Am I allowed? I'm going to just jump in here and copy this link in the chat. I'm not as proficient in FHIR or FISH as any of these folks here, but there are so many amazing tools for FISH. And at FISH School, there's this FISH Online tool that you can copy a snippet of what something you've been working on FISH and actually share with somebody to help debug or work on. And it highlights and does everything to help highlight the different features and of FISH as you go, but it's just amazing. It's just so nice to use and so easy to help use. There's so many great tools. And so even with my limited tech skills, I feel like it's very approachable.
And I'll add that FISH Online has an examples button that you can click, which will load up a number of examples of different types of things you can do in FISH in FHIR Shorthand. And you can even load those examples directly into the editor and try running them through Sushi, modify them, see how that changes them. So it really is a fun little learning tool as well. I did see, while I'm already talking, I did see a question. Julia asked, would it FHIR Shorthand be a tool to develop FHIR test cases for measures? I think that was when May was talking about using it for examples and such. So if by that question you're asking, could I use FISH to create, say, example patients and conditions and things like that, that we could then feed into a FHIR measure to see how it evaluates? I think the answer is yes. One advantage that FHIR Shorthand has is that it's a lot easier to write and a lot harder to mess up than having to write JSON or XML directly. So if you're just comparing FHIR Shorthand versus JSON or XML, then for sure, I think there are some advantages to using FHIR Shorthand. One nice thing that FHIR Shorthand allows you to do, and we won't be able to get into too many details here, but it allows you to create something called rule sets, which are kind of like little macros that contain snippets of FHIR Shorthand definitions that you can apply in different contexts. And so I could imagine when creating test patients for measures, you might have some things that come up often. So you might often want to, depending on the measure, if you have a measure that's, measuring something about, say, diabetes, then you could have a rule set or a snippet, if you will, that knows how to create a diabetes condition, and you could have it insert different onset date times if your measure might be based on onset or other things. And then when you create patients, you can actually just use that rule set to insert that data into the patient bundle. And so there's ways that rather than having to actually copy paste a lot of data all over the place because it's similar from patient to patient to patient, you could use FHIR Shorthand to create mechanisms where you can insert those multiple times and create little parameters that just tweak little inputs that might govern how that measure should or should not operate. So I think that would be a good use case for something like this.
Kathleen Connor asked, how could FISH help ensure alignment among IGs besides having lists of other FISH IGs? Could FISH evolve as an IG design framework? As May suggested, how to craft from matter, how to design with privacy, security, trust, and provenance considerations appropriate for an IG use case.
Well, that's a really interesting and challenging question, Kathleen. Thank you for asking it. I think there is a big issue about alignment between IGs, and it's both a matter of being able to search out what's been done and be aware of other IGs out there. So there's a couple of questions here. So far we haven't addressed that in FHIR Shorthand. And I don't know whether the FHIR Shorthand environment itself is the best way to address that. Other tools like the IG registry allows searching and, searching on text fields or names or by resource. And that seems like it's a foundation for doing what you're suggesting here, which is searching among IGs. We've thought about the idea that when you start creating a profile, FISH would be so smart that it would go out and find things and say, hey, it looks like you want to create a profile that deals with diabetes, and here's some profiles to work with. But we haven't really gotten past that stage because it requires as a back end that kind of search facility. The second one you're talking about, and I consider these two different things, can we evolve it into more an IG design framework? And yeah, so Sushi is the compiler part of FHIR Shorthand. FHIR Shorthand is the language, and then Sushi is the way to create the IG. And actually, Sushi does much more than just implement the language. It actually prepares things in a way that can be consumed by the IG publisher. And we're already nibbling away at some of the, non-creative tasks, the routine, error-prone steps that you need to take every time you change names of pages and do other, you rename things so you forget to rename files that may be keyed into names of resources. So little things like that to make and do them either pre or post or inside Sushi. So lives of IG developers get easier. We've thought about templating, like templating pages, but we haven't seen strong patterns between IGs, and so I don't know whether we can do anything beyond what the kind of standard HL7 FHIR templates do. But there's still a lot that FHIR Shorthand doesn't do that you need to do to create an IG. But there's no AI yet that we've built into FISH to try and solve those problems. But I'm sure Chris is going to, right? Or is it Max?
Yeah, I think Max was going to do that one. No, but I was also going to mention it's not AI or anything like that, but if you've just been looking at FHIR Shorthand as a language for your IG development, but not using the Visual Studio Code extension for FHIR Shorthand, then you are missing on some aspects of our authoring environment and framework that can be really helpful. So if you are using the VS Code extension, then that gets you things like syntax highlighting, which is a really nice visual confirmation that your FHIR Shorthand looks correct. It also now features code completion or path completion, so that if you start, say, a profile on observation, and in your rule, you start to type component, then VS Code will be smart enough to know once you've typed CO that you probably want component, and it'll actually show you component as a valid option. And then when you hit dot, it'll show you all of the fields that are underneath component in observation, which can be a really nice assist when you are developing FHIR implementation guides and profiles. And there are some additional features in there, like the ability to navigate between definitions, or even open FHIR documentation for a resource that you are profiling at the time. So that also kind of fits into this idea of a development framework for IGs, as far as just trying to make the tool suite a little nicer and easier to use for authors.
Yeah, I definitely echo that, and so appreciate the VS Code extension. It has made my life a ton easier than not having it. So if anyone has been playing around with it and not used it, then you're definitely missing out. I would also add to, for those who are new to VS Code, that there are other extensions that complement that so nicely, especially the GitHub extension that allows you, especially, if you are working within a group that's doing multiple contributions, to see who actually did what at one point when you start pulling in some of the changes into your branch. So I think that combination of extensions, a number of others that are definitely helpful. You'll see in some, I think thanks to Max who introduced it, you can bring in plant UML, and now that helps, add in, very nice, pleasant to see, graphics for messaging flows, that helps to complement your front matter. And again, knowing that the IGs need to be not necessarily just, strong and technical, but probably needs to reach out an audience of multiple different backgrounds. So I think the combination of VS Code extensions, play around with the ones that work, and for sure the one that is the FISH extension has been extremely helpful. One more thing, I think, just going back to the point of how else one could use FISH. Again, I treat it very much like a way that I can make some of my work quicker. And for, again, out of the box thinking for it, I needed to create a lot of examples for the FHIR to OMOP Connectathon track this past May. And I was migrating Cynthia examples, which came as either, FHIR or CSV. There's two ways that one could have done that. And I did the script, I did the Python script migration method. So I basically took, a CSV file of multiple, different, conditions and lab results and, other observations. And it was so much faster to just do this conversion script to FISH syntax, put it in a fish tank, and then just run the IG. And at first I thought it wouldn't scale, but after, putting in about 2,000 examples, it didn't take too long. And, if you have memory on your system, I would say probably, like a 32 gig, at least on my Apple Mac OS laptop. It ran really well and only took about 6 minutes. So that was very surprising. It really generated a lot of examples really quick. And yeah, again, I would think outside the box on how you can use these wonderful tools.
Great, thank you, May. And next we wanted to take some time to see if anyone had any questions for those of you who took the course, feedback or questions specifically to the course.
Yeah, and if you don't have questions, but you do have feedback, like, what worked really well for you, what didn't work so well for you, if we were to offer this course again, how could we improve it? We'd love to hear that as well.
This is Kim. I just wanted to add, we will send out a quick post-event survey too, with some a way for you to give us some feedback. So you can put your thoughts in there.
For feedback, it would be very useful to show how to use FSH and Cynthia, particularly in advance of Connectathons, because by the time you get to Connectathon, it's too late to really create stuff.
Yeah, I totally hear you. Again, that that was kind of the, do I wait for others to suddenly find their own method of how to create examples. I think Cynthia is a great way to do it. Given that the way synthetic data is generated oftentimes has this preconceived notion of using the framework within Cynthia. So there's some preassumptions. That's one way. But if you, maybe I can take this offline. But what I've been finding as an interesting paradigm is that if you want to have an environment in creating examples that brings in non-technical clinical people, they oftentimes think in terms of spreadsheets, right? You're not going to start going back and forth. You don't have that time for Connectathon and examples. So the spreadsheet method of here are your relevant elements and then converting them to FSH syntax, which is, there's so much intelligence behind it of what you would fill in for code systems because, and the cardinality behind it. It now simplifies it in a way that if your focus is now on, well, let's create a simple artifact that you can share around with these clinicians to fill in the spreadsheet and you convert it to FSH syntax, you don't have to be worrying too much, again, as Chris had mentioned about JSON and XML and trying to explain that. It takes the complexity away from it, right? And the conversion is a lot simpler because you have less lines of code in FSH syntax to generate all that complexity. And I think that worked well. If I were to continue that kind of work, that's the kind of tooling I would probably want to do. For those that are familiar with how other means of examples are created that involves a clinical community, one could go to ClinFire, but if you see that interface, it basically is you enter one field in at a time, and then you happen to get one instance. And while that's nice as a learning tool, it might not be enough. To generate a lot of examples, which say, like in the case of OMOP or observational studies, you usually need a lot, right? You probably need in the hundreds at least. So, so maybe that's something that could be thought of. And I think, converting it to FSH syntax is a very nice intermediary, at least for now.
Great. Anyone else? Questions, feedback? If not, I believe Max has a question. You want to come up?
I was sitting here thinking about putting examples in IGs, and I realized that I never had thought through how do you know if you have enough examples or sufficiently good example coverage for an IG? Is there any best practice around that?
Well, I wouldn't call it a best practice, Max, but the requirement by HL7 is that you have one example for each profile and extension. So that's certainly minimal. And I guess the challenge there is to make them non-trivial and to make them connect to each other to express some meaningful clinical situation, because one could make sort of random single examples and it's not very helpful. So if you think in terms of user story or a use case, go back to the original. I think it was May who was right on when she said, you know, scope your IG to a defined use case that, you know, you agree that this has value. So go back to that use case when you're thinking about the examples and maybe illustrate the use case through a set of examples. And that'll help for a number of purposes. One, here's a real life situation, and you're translating that real life situation to FHIR resources. And you're also taking perhaps a workflow, a sequence of events, and you can show how that sequence of events plays out dynamically with those examples. So you could even, you know, show here's the patient before the encounter, here's the patient after the encounter, here's the encounter, you know, resource, and here's the medication request that was generated, you know. So you can play the desired use case, and then you're at that point you can really test if your ideas are working. You know, if there's holes in your use case, or you know, situations that you came up with without thinking of FHIR that are difficult to map into FHIR resources, it might you might discover them at that point.
Yeah, and I would add on to, you know, Mark's point as well on, you know, the benefits of doing that, and I can put that in the chat as well, because we did this for MCode as well. You know, we basically identified a patient journey that had particular, you know, a timeline in it, and we backed the examples in, right? So you can see where the appropriate, you know, profiles made sense at that point in time, as well as examples that were related to that. Now, you know, mind you, that doesn't take away from the HL7 requirement as well. You know, as Mark mentioned, that every profile that you define should have at least one example. But at least what it does is not only are you showing that example, it also puts it in context.
Okay, great. We had another question in the chat, and it reads, are there any naming rule for extensions? Or more broadly, are there naming rules or best practices for resources?
So I can speak to that a little bit regarding the rules. So one sort of tricky thing in FHIR is that there are several names for an artifact, if you will. So when it comes to something like a profile, there is what FHIR calls the name, there's what FHIR calls the title, and what FHIR calls the ID. So the ID is the thing that really should be unique within the implementation guide for the particular type that it is, in this case a profile. FHIR has some rules around this. IDs can only be 64 characters at max. They can be A through Z, 0 through 9. The letters can be A through Z, 0 through 9, dot and dash. And then there's name. Now, name in FHIR is really intended to be a computer-friendly thing, so that when there are things that might do code generation based on your profile, they use the name to create, say, a class in some programming language. So there's rules around that as well, such as it should start with a capital letter. It can only be letters, numbers, underscores, and it doesn't allow dashes or dots, and it needs to be 255 characters or less. And then there's titles, which are the human-friendly titles. So the titles are much more loose. You can put nearly any character that you want. You can put spaces, and that's really just for human consumption. So there are definitely rules that are specified in the FHIR specification. If you violate any of these rules, when you compile your FHIR shorthand using Sushi, Sushi will actually tell you that you violated one of those rules. So it won't let you make that mistake without at least warning you that you've made the mistake. As far as best practices for naming, you want to make sure that your names are descriptive so that when somebody sees the name of the thing, that it's fairly clear what it is. You do want to ensure that your names are unique. You don't want to name two different things, give two different things the same name in your IG, generally speaking. We talked again about the name, the ID, and the title. I think that it makes a lot of sense for those three things to at least be fairly similar. There's different rules around how they have to be formatted, but you don't want the title to be completely different than the name, completely different than the ID. You should be able to sort of understand the relationship between those. I don't know if I am more around the tools than actually creating real IGs myself. So I don't know if some of the folks who are behind MCode or other IGs would like to chime in with other best practices for naming that they've stumbled upon.
Well, I'll share one, not necessarily on profiles, but going back to examples. If there are examples that you want to have, as to demonstrate like a grouping of them, right? Depending upon this belongs to an organization or this belongs to something else, I would actually prepend that first, because it's, when you see the output of, all the artifacts, which oftentimes happens in an IG, you'll see the whole dump of it. It's hard to make sense of what it means. The other thing too is that, know that the naming for your examples is only, it's only for illustrative purposes in your IG. Be pretty clear that realistically, what makes sense is that the IDs, which end up being in the order of, in the way it gets represented, realistically should be in its implementation some kind of UUID. So I would have a clear naming convention if you're going to illustrate examples, and just just think through how you would want to organize it. I think that gets a little bit unruly as well.
I just want to cut in because we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. So I don't know if any folks have last minute questions they'd like to address and bring up for folks here. I wanted to cover some of the questions that were brought up in the chat. This recording will be shared in the webinar. We'll make sure that it's available for all. And then also the resources will continue to be available. The course resources, as well as the FHIR Shorthand website, will be available. So please share with anyone you think would be interested in IG authoring. I can't remember, is there someplace on the course so you can continue to ask questions at the Zulip channel, that will be screened periodically, maybe not within 24 hours, but at some time period. So any questions continued about fish or any other related topics, please feel free to enter there. And we're excited to learn from you, and hopefully you feel like you're learning from us. I always find it amazing how usable and friendly fish is, despite how difficult and technical it can sound for folks new to this world here on this on this forum here. If you're new to FHIR Shorthand, I do want to say I was recently new to this world as well, and it is not as intimidating as it may sound at times. And so one last call for any comments from our panelists or moderator, and also from our audience. If you have any questions about CodeX or anything else related to our FHIR Accelerator, I had entered my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime. There's Peter Muir. Peter, would you like to come off of mute?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you folks for doing this. This whole week project's been really good. Documentation's been good. I was able to get things set up. Kudos to Chris for his video. I'm working my way through that. So this has been very, very helpful. I just wanted to call it out and kind of suggest you do this again.
Thank you. And if there's anybody on the call that will be attending FHIR Dev Days coming up in a couple of weeks in Cleveland, or connecting to the hybrid Dev Days, Mark is going to be giving an introduction to FHIR Shorthand there. I'll be doing a Let's Build session, which the Let's Build session is in person only, but the tutorial is also online for those who have registered for Dev Days. So you can also continue your learning there.